So I hope that you feel the eyes, as I was saying, of the global telecom being here, because the US has taken the mantle of bringing trust back to one of the other channels. We have some challenge on SMS already, and we're trying to address it. But certainly, we don't pick up the phones anymore. I don't. I'm questioning any time I receive a call. Before I go and tell you about my personal experience, though, and we only have 20 minutes, so we'll have to be super fast. Let's start from the basic, though. And I'll start with Matt, if that's okay. So let's talk about a bit more about what branded calling is or is not. I mean, how you define it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dario. So I'll tell you this. I can't ever talk about branded calling without telling a story first, a very quick story. So first, Orion started as a company focused on more mobile subscriber protection, so preventing unwanted calls from getting to handsets. And we did that, and it's evolved a lot over the years. But one of the things that we realized is that consumers felt protected or more protected from the unwanted calls, but they still didn't trust the phone enough to answer calls that were not identified coming into their handsets. And so a number of years ago, we created this thing called branded calling, where an enterprise, not unlike RCS in terms of branded messaging, has the ability to include their identity on a phone call on the consumer handset, which puts them more in control of the consumer experience on the handset itself. So there's a couple of different flavors. All of them involve a very high level of trust and security and authentication that we're going to talk a little bit more about on the panel here. But at a very high level, branded calling is the ability for an enterprise to insert a name, a logo, and in many cases, a reason for the call on their call when it terminates to the handset itself.
So help me out as well. Is it branded calling, making sure that your brand is on the call, but it's also avoiding that other people don't use negative?
Yeah, that's right. So on the front end, to get into the ecosystem, there's a very complex vetting process. It's multifaceted, but we focus on a very direct and strategic relationship with the business customer themselves. Requires us, again, not unlike messaging, it requires us to verify that the entity is who they say they are, that they're legitimate, that the representative reaching out is authorized to act on behalf of that business. And once we do all of those things, we go through an additional step of verifying what we call TN right of use, or telephone number right of use, where we have to ensure that, okay, we know you're a legitimate business, but do you have the right to essentially brand these phone numbers as the enterprise you're calling on behalf of? And I'm using the word enterprise loosely here. I'm really talking about any business that makes calls, outbound calls. That includes SMBs all the way up to the largest enterprise.
Because back to the little story that I was saying, in the end, it's not just about having a brand there. It's making sure that people start trusting the medium. So we go back to answering the phone call when somebody calls because we trust that that's going to be a proper and a rightful message is going to come toward them.
Yeah, that's right. We've seen tremendous value. I don't know if Jim wants to add on here.
Yeah, I was going to just add on a little bit, Matt. When you talk about the KYC standards, know your customer. I think that's probably been talked a lot about here on the messaging side. We kind of follow the same processes as well. Want to make sure that again, we're protecting the customer. Our number one thing, with Verizon and the other carriers that we support, it's all about protecting the consumer first, and then as a way of providing more enterprise information so that they can then trust that call. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, Matt. I think we've probably turned down more enterprises that wanted to try to brand on our platform, and then we've actually, where we've seen, kind of bad actors, or somebody that's maybe a little bit, less legitimate. There are, maybe one or two that I think that we've kicked off. Every time that we do, we always communicate across the three companies to make sure that, that each one of our respective publishers and carriers are protected.
So a little of a special situation here. So you're all competing, but you all represent a separate carrier. So you could say that between yourself, you cover T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon. So the majority, the large carriers, to say. So hence the tick of we got a great service available to a large number of users. But that's why. Back to your presentations. Back to 6 months ago when your CEO stood up in front of lots of people and said, we are here to tell you a nice story that this is starting now. What's the story right now in numbers, Jim? I mean, do you have something to share? That I want to tell everybody externally, outside of the US as well, is this starting to show some good signs of?
Yeah, no, great question, Dario. We've seen, we said that we were going to, hit the 5 billion. And again, I don't want to, put on my Austin Powers, gold member, but that's 5 billion that we've branded to date.
5 billion calls. I can do that. 5 billion.
5 billion calls, correct.
Yeah.
And so, we're seeing about 100% growth year over year, which on a billion is a lot. So if you kind of translate that out to how much we're going to see every quarter, we're going to see net new of 1 billion calls every single quarter, and we continue to add to our reach. We just added U.S. Cellular as a carrier. Okay. In February. We'll continue to add additional terminating service providers as we see fit. And then we've kind of taken it a little bit beyond branded calling with authentication and what we call spoof protection or call protection blocking. We all call it a little bit differently, but it all does the same thing. In the last 10 days, looking at the numbers, we've probably blocked or labeled the call as potentially harmful than other platforms have seen in their entirety. So again, we're seeing great growth. Enterprises are starting to adopt it, but I think the other pieces, and Matt kind of hit on this before, is we've got a lot of SMBs that sit in there too. So while we've got 15% of the the Fortune 500, from that perspective, we're seeing a lot of SMBs too. I think we're probably over 5,000 enterprises, SMBs that are branding today. So that's all good news. I think education is starting to get out there, and how can I benefit from this?
Well, let me point again to some of these numbers because it's interesting. First, you got at least 4 with the U.S. Cellular as well of the big networks covered. 5 billion calls in 2024. You've seen 100% growth, and you got 5,000 companies, enterprises, small, medium, and large companies that are actively using the service. Any other data? I mean, this is good. I'm trying to be the analyst in me wants to know more. Any other numbers anybody of you can throw out there, or any stories there?
So I think to maybe talk a little bit about what the potential is, right? So in the U.S., I think the business is becoming pretty mature, and so we feel like we can predict the growth, and we have plans, programs in place to sort of make it more secure and add more value. Outside of the U.S., in Brazil, for example, they sort of took an approach of building a holistic call authentication and branding system, like all in one. The carriers decided to all work together and build one system. And their ability to sort of influence their own ecosystem within that country, right, both on the regulatory side with the device manufacturers, enabled them to go from 0 to 100 million authenticated transactions in the calendar year, and I think around 25 million logos. So from 0 to 25 million in about a year with a sort of tighter focus. So I know we're talking about the US, but I know there are international people representing international businesses, and so it really is an international opportunity, and there's a bunch of different ways to get there.
Well, Henry, you probably touched a very nice topic, because in the audience we have multiple carriers, we have CPAs, CSPs, political companies serving political parties and so on. But all of them might be asking the same question, is what's in it for me? What can they do? Are they going to be participating in these ecosystems?
Sure. So, I mean, again, that's going to sort of vary market by market. But in the U.S., there is a there's because the U.S. was first with a lot of these things, there is a lot of, I guess, investment and effort into making it consumer safe, right? The priority of the mobile operators that we are sort of agents for, that we work for, is protection of the consumer. So, starting with the first thing that they did in reaction to this sort of rise in robocalls and scam calls and all this was deploy analytics platforms. Those weren't to make business calling better, that was to protect the consumer. And so if you think of that as their central theme, the relationship for vetting and determining which numbers get branded and which ones don't, they want to keep that with their trusted partners that they've been building this with for, in many cases, almost 10 years, right? The requirement to scale requires trust, right? At the end of the day, like, this whole thing falls apart if it becomes untrusted. And so the role for a lot of the carriers and aggregators and CPaaSs and CCaaSs that are out there today is to sort of participate in the building of that trust. With the growth of branded calling with logo being sort of a thing that the carriers really want to see, and the growth of the ability to block spoofed calls to keep them from terminating to the consumers, those all require end-to-end call authentication, right? And we all sort of know that StirShaken's not quite getting us there right now. So there's a tremendous role for these aggregators to play, because most of them have StirShaken technologies, and most of them actually have pretty good, onboarding systems. They have KYC. Well, they don't all have, but some have good KYC programs in place to where they do understand who their customers are. And so working with those to enable call authentication at scale is going to help the ecosystem grow. And so there's certainly a role to play and some revenue to be had for the aggregators and providers there. I know that what everybody wants is to be able to sort of, just have a click of the button and sign up for it through their service, but I don't think that the ecosystem in any branded calling environment is quite there yet.
Okay. And that's because of it. Security, know your customer.
It's zero trust at the end of the day, right? Like, we all know, there's nobody in this room. I mean, who in this room completely trusts SMS? Like, trust SMS,
this is
trust
a safe
MMS,
space.
trust voice
We're
calls.
not going to tell anything externally.
Do you trust anything? Do you trust anything with communications? Okay, well, let's start there with we don't trust anything. And so we need to have as much first-party authentication, or at best second-party authentication, with trust signals embedded into that authentication to make this thing go.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to kind of jump on with that Henry said about, kind of StirShaken and, and trust and the end-to-end authentication. The end-to-end authentication that we've built, we've actually seen, calls that are not authenticated by the enterprise with A-level attestation. And there's, you can look at, the Joe Biden deepfake that had A-level attestation. You can go look at the tracebacks that U.S. Telecom has done, over time, and you can see that a good portion of those are A-level attested. So, again, StirShaken was a great step in the right direction, provides great traceability, and it is one part of the equation and the analytics that Henry talked about.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add to, what about non-U.S., right? We talked about the U.S. because it started here in the U.S. That's where we got traction, and that's where we got coverage. And so one of the things that we'd love to talk more about with anyone who represents a platform or a carrier in the room is that non-U.S. opportunity. Europe, in particular, is very awake to branded calling for the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, 6 years ago, there was no demand for branded calling. The question was, does voice even still work? Is it still relevant? And now we've got a lot of large outbound callers that are saying this branded calling thing works. What other countries can you get me to? And so we've got a lot of carriers that are reaching out and saying, whatever you're doing in the U.S., we want some version of that too. And so we're working very, very quickly across the globe to enable this at scale. A lot of the big platforms that are out there are very interested in participating in a multitude of different ways, and we're doing our best to respond to that now.
Which reminds me of one of the questions we got, some of these questions, and later on we'll love to share more from the US experiences anyway through our working groups and so on. So any of you would like to add to what we said today, use us as your amplifying. Before I go and ask questions, I'm going to ask you to sum in 30 seconds or less. What would you ask them? That's everybody. We start from the carrier, the communication provider, the solution provider. What can they do to make these a success? Henry, you start. Okay.
So, I mean, obviously, like if you're a carrier and you represent an enterprise's business interest, reach out and have a dialogue with us, right? We are working to kind of make things more accessible, to apply the strengths that we individually have and collectively have in the market to make things more accessible for more people to participate. So, call Authentication Federation, right? Just because you do call authentication with TransUnion doesn't mean that you can't be a sort of, customer of First Orion or TNS. So the concept of working with us to kind of grow what can be considered, trusted voice is really important. I mean, that's the most important thing that I would ask for anybody that's in the voice